Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to imagine something so enormous, so all-encompassing, that it's almost impossible to picture in its entirety. Imagine 66 million years of silence. Not complete silence. No. The wind still moved, the ocean still breathed, rain still fell across the continents in long silver curtains, but a particular kind of noise had stopped, a particular kind of life had gone quiet, and in that quiet, something else was beginning. That's what we're going to explore tonight. Not the death of the dinosaurs. That story I think you already know, at least the broad strokes of it. The asteroid, the fire, the winter that came after. We've all heard that story. But here's what I've always found curious. What I find myself thinking about on slow evenings when the world gets quiet and my mind starts to wander into strange, wonderful places. Nobody talks much about what came after, not just the days after, not the years after, but the real after. The long, strange, winding road that the world travelled in the wake of that catastrophe. The things that filled the silence, the creatures that emerged from the darkness. The way the Earth, slowly, patiently, stubbornly, decided to try again. And tonight, I want to take you on that journey. But I should warn you, there are some things about this story that surprised me when I first learned them. Things that don't quite match the neat, tidy version of history we were taught in school. Small mysteries tucked inside the larger narrative. Clues that, when you line them all up, start to suggest something rather extraordinary. So settle in. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Because we're going somewhere very old tonight. And the first thing you need to understand is this. The extinction wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of one. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let's begin at the very beginning of the after, or rather the very last moments of the before. It's a morning in what we would now call the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, though of course there was no such name then, no names at all in any language we would recognize. There are no humans within 63 million years of this moment. There is no one to name anything. But something is happening in the sky. It has been happening for a little while now, a brightening streak, a point of light that started small and grew. Some animals, the more perceptive ones, the ones with wider fields of vision or sharper instincts, may have noticed it. A few birds, and yes, there were birds then, real birds, the direct descendants of certain small feathered dinosaurs, may have tilted their heads toward the sky, looked at that streak with their round, ancient eyes, felt something they had no word for. Unease, maybe, or just curiosity. There was a triceratops herd moving through the lowlands that morning. 3 adults and 2 juveniles moving slowly through a forest of flowering plants, angiosperms, we call them now, which had only relatively recently become a dominant part of the landscape. The world was already changing even before the asteroid. The dinosaurs had lived through enormous changes in their time. They were not fragile. They were not doomed in any ordinary sense. The herd moved, and the calves pressed close to the adults the way young things do, and the trees were very green, and the morning was warm. I think about that herd sometimes. I think about how ordinary their morning was, how completely, magnificently ordinary, and I think about how they had no way of knowing. The object, we know it now as the Chicxulub impactor, was roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across. Some estimates put it closer to 12. To give you a sense of scale, Mount Everest is about 9 kilometers tall. This thing was larger than the tallest mountain on Earth, and it was travelling at perhaps 20 kilometers per second. It had been travelling through space for billions of years, a leftover piece of the solar system's formation, drifting in the dark on its own quiet path until the gravitational geometry of the solar system, over millions of years, nudged it gradually toward Earth. It didn't know where it was going. It didn't know anything. And yet, what it was about to do would remake the entire history of life on this planet. It would clear the stage. It would, in a very real sense, make us possible. The impact itself, the actual moment of contact, released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The rock didn't just hit the ground. It bored through the atmosphere so fast that the air didn't have time to move out of the way. It compressed the air ahead of it into a plasma jet that was, itself, hot enough to ignite fires thousands of miles away before the rock even reached the surface. Then it hit, and the world changed. I won't dwell on the violence of that moment for too long. This is, after all, a story meant to ease you towards sleep, and there's a gentleness I want to maintain even when discussing enormous catastrophes. But I do want to sit with the sheer scale of it for just a moment, because without that scale, the story of what came next doesn't quite make sense. The impact crater, the Chicxulub crater, buried now beneath the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, is approximately 150 kilometers wide. That's roughly the size of a small country. The explosion vaporized rock and flung debris into the upper atmosphere, where it circled the globe. Massive tsunamis radiated outward across the oceans. Wildfires ignited across entire continents as superheated ejecta rained back down from orbit. And then, this is the part that truly ended the dinosaurs. The dust settled into the stratosphere and stayed there for months, perhaps years, blocking the sun. Without sunlight, the plants died. Without plants, the plant-eaters starved. Without plant-eaters, the predators had nothing to hunt. And so the Great Cascade began, the unravelling of a world that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build. But here's where I want you to pay very close attention, because this is where the mystery begins to emerge. The extinction didn't happen overnight. We sometimes imagine it as a sudden switch. Dinosaurs here one moment, gone the next. And while the impact itself was certainly sudden, the process of extinction played out over thousands of years. The geological record shows us that. Species declined gradually in some areas. The collapse was severe, but it moved at the pace of ecosystems, not explosions. And in that slow, terrible dying, some things survived. More things than you might expect. More things than the simple story would suggest. And what survived, and how and why, that's where the real story lives. The immediate aftermath of the Chicxulub impact is often described as a nuclear winter, and that analogy is helpful up to a point. The sun was blocked. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Global average temperatures may have fallen by somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees Celsius. That's enough to kill most vegetation on Earth. That's enough to turn a tropical paradise into something approaching a frozen wasteland in the span of months. Months! That's how fast the world changed. The Triceratops herd from that morning, I find myself returning to them, those animals in their last ordinary day. They would not have survived long. Their food source would have collapsed. The lush forests of flowering plants that had defined their world would have gone brown and then frozen and then silent. The calves, who needed the most food and had the least fat reserves, would have gone first. It is, I will admit, a difficult thing to think about, but I don't want to linger in the grief of it. Because the grief is real. There's something genuinely melancholy about the end of the non-avian dinosaurs, these extraordinary animals that had dominated the Earth for over 160 million years. But the grief is not the whole story. The other part of the story is the tunnel that led through the darkness and out the other side, and the creatures who found it. Let me tell you about a small, warm-bodied mammal. It doesn't have a name, not yet, not in any sense we would recognize. It is small enough to fit in your palm. It has whiskers and wide eyes suited to moving in low light. It has a long, somewhat flexible snout. It has grasping feet, the kind good for clinging to branches. It has been awake for most of its short life in the dark. Not because the asteroid made the world dark, at least not yet. It was dark before that. The world of the dinosaurs for most of their reign was a world where large animals ruled the day and the small. Mammals who shared that world had learned, over millions of years, to be largely nocturnal, to be small, to be quiet, to eat things that the dinosaurs didn't particularly want. Insects, seeds, small reptiles, anything they could find in the gaps and margins of the dominant world. They had been living in the margins for 160 million years. That is a very long time to wait. And in that waiting, they had developed some very useful things. Warm blood, for one. The ability to maintain their own body temperature independently of the environment, which would become extraordinarily important when the temperature of the environment collapsed. Small size, meaning lower calorie requirements, meaning survival was possible on less food. Burrowing behavior in many lineages, meaning access to insulated underground spaces when the surface became inhospitable. An ability to eat almost anything, seeds, carrion, insects, roots, whatever was available. These things were not designed for survival. Nothing in evolution is designed for anything. That's one of the great misunderstandings of how life works. These traits had evolved for completely different reasons, under completely different pressures. They were adaptations to living in a world ruled by large reptiles. They were the shape that life takes when it is small and marginal, and constantly dodging the footsteps of giants. But when the giants were gone, those traits turned out to be exactly what was needed. And so the small, warm, wide-eyed creature in the dark found itself in a world that was suddenly, catastrophically, completely different from the one its ancestors had navigated. The giants were dying, the margins were opening up, and the creature who had always lived in the margins had no idea, could not possibly have had any idea, what was about to become possible. There is something I want to sit with here for just a moment, because I find it genuinely moving in a quiet way. The mammals that survived the extinction event, our ancestors, in a very real sense the distant roots of the lineage that eventually produced us, survived not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most impressive. They survived because they were the most adaptable, because they were the most flexible, because they had spent 160 million years figuring out how to make do with very little. There's something almost instructive about that, but maybe that's just me reading things into the story that aren't quite there. It's a habit I have. Let's move on though, because the story gets more interesting, and stranger, and in some ways more surprising. We tend to focus on mammals when we talk about the survivors of the end Cretaceous extinction event, and for good reason. We are mammals after all. We have a somewhat understandable bias toward our own lineage. But the mammals were not the only survivors, and some of the other survivors are, I think, at least as interesting. Maybe more interesting. Because some of them challenged the simple story in ways that quietly opened up a much larger mystery when I first started looking into them. Let's begin with the birds. Birds, as you may know, are technically dinosaurs. Not metaphorically, not loosely. Technically, biologically exactly, birds are the living descendants of theropod dinosaurs, specifically a group called the Maniraptorans, and within that group the lineage that gave rise to birds. The oldest known bird, Archaeopteryx, lived about 150 million years ago during the Jurassic period. By the time the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous, birds were a diverse and globally distributed group of animals. Most of them went extinct. The birds that existed in the Cretaceous, the enantiornithines, the hesperornithiforms, most of the major groups, disappeared along with the non-avian dinosaurs. The skies were not spared, but a few lineages made it through, and the question of exactly which birds survived, and why those specific lineages survived while others didn't, is one of the more quietly fascinating puzzles in paleontology. The current thinking is that the birds which survived were primarily ground-dwelling seed-eating species. After the impact, the forest canopies collapsed, trees died, and the complex vertical ecosystems of the forest were flattened. But seeds can persist in the ground for a long time. Seeds are tough. Seeds can wait out a winter that lasts years. Ground-dwelling birds that could eat seeds could, in principle, find food even in a landscape where everything else had died. And so those birds survived. From those survivors, a relatively small number of lineages, possibly just a handful. All living birds eventually descended. Every bird you've ever seen, the sparrow on your windowsill, the heron standing still at the water's edge, the albatross drifting over the open ocean, the peacock with its absurd and wonderful tail, all of them trace their ancestry back to a small number of ground-dwelling seed-eaters who happened to be in the right place, doing the right things, at the moment the world ended. That lineage thing is something I keep coming back to. The idea that the entire extraordinary diversity of modern birds, 10,000 species, filling every ecological niche from deep ocean diving to mountain soaring, descended from what might have been just a few dozen surviving populations 66 million years ago. Life is an astonishing thing, but birds and mammals weren't the only survivors. Let me tell you about some others, because this is where things start to get interesting in a slightly different way. Crocodilians survived. The ancestors of modern crocodiles and alligators, which look almost exactly like their Cretaceous relatives, which tells you something about how well suited to their environment they were, made it through the extinction. How? Crocodilians are ambush predators. They spend long periods waiting, motionless, metabolically suppressed, requiring very little food. They can go months without eating. They inhabit rivers and wetlands, which were among the more sheltered environments during the impact aftermath. Their eggs can survive in underground nests for extended periods. Crocodilians were built for waiting, in other words, and the extinction event in part was a test of who could wait the longest. turtles and tortoises survived. Same story, really. Slow metabolism, the ability to estivate, enter a dormant state, protected eggs, ability to eat almost anything. Lizards and snakes survived. Though many lineages were lost, the basic groups persisted. Small body size, low calorie requirements, burrowing capability. Many freshwater fish survived. Freshwater ecosystems, while badly damaged, were somewhat buffered from the worst effects of the extinction. The nutrients washing into rivers from the dying landscape actually created temporary food surges for certain filter feeders and bottom dwellers. Many marine invertebrates, clams, snails, sea urchins, made it through in reduced numbers. Even some plant groups managed to survive through seeds and spores and underground root systems. And here is what I find worth pausing on. The things that survived were not the impressive things. They were not the spectacular things. The survivors were the hidden things, the patient things, the buried things, the small and adaptable things. The world that emerged from the extinction was not going to be built by the survivors of the old world's achievements. It was going to be built by the survivors of the old world's margins. That is, I think, one of the most beautiful and quietly profound things about the history of life. But again, maybe I'm projecting. Now, here is where I want to introduce the first real mystery, and I want you to pay close attention, because this mystery is going to thread through everything we discuss tonight, and it doesn't fully resolve itself until much later in the story. In fact, it doesn't fully resolve itself until you understand something about the nature of what we think we know. The mystery is this: among the survivors, there are some that shouldn't have survived, or at least some that survived in ways that our models of the extinction don't entirely explain. One example: certain large freshwater species. The logic of survival after the Chicxulub impact suggests small body size was critical. Small bodies need less food, and food was desperately scarce. Yet some relatively large freshwater animals made it through. How? Another example: the geographic distribution of survivors. If the extinction was global and catastrophic, we would expect the pattern of who survived and who didn't to be fairly consistent across regions. But when paleontologists have done detailed regional studies, they find that the picture is considerably messier than the clean global narrative suggests. Some regions show higher survival rates than expected, some show lower. The pattern is patchy in a way that still invites debate. A third example, and this is the one that most intrigues me, is what happened to certain plant lineages. Some groups of plants that should have been wiped out by the loss of sunlight and the collapse of forest ecosystems appeared again in the fossil record surprisingly quickly. Too quickly, some researchers have suggested, to have recovered from near-total devastation. What if some populations weren't devastated? What if there were refugia, sheltered zones where conditions were less catastrophic, that we haven't fully mapped? Or what if something else is going on? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Let's follow the story forward in time and see where it leads us. The Paleocene epoch began approximately 66 million years ago, and lasted until about 56 million years ago. 10 million years. That's the amount of time it takes a world to begin to heal. And heal it did, though not quickly and not smoothly. The first thing to understand about the Paleocene is that it was weird. Not weird in the way of nightmares. No, nothing violent or frightening. But weird in the quiet way of dreams. Weird in the way of things that are familiar and strange at the same time. Imagine a forest, a tropical forest, because in the early Paleocene the world was warm. Warmer than today, warmer than the late Cretaceous even, as volcanic activity and the altered atmosphere pushed greenhouse gases higher. This forest has trees, real trees, recognizable trees. There are ferns, there are mosses, there is dappled light falling through a canopy of green. But when you look at the animals moving through this forest, something is wrong. Wrong isn't quite the right word. Unfamiliar, maybe, unexpected. The large animals that move through the Paleocene forests are not the majestic, perfectly evolved creatures you might imagine. They are, in many cases, awkward, lumbering, almost experimental looking, as if evolution is still figuring out what large animals should be. Because it is. The ecological roles that had been filled by the dinosaurs, the large herbivores that kept vegetation in check, the large predators that kept the herbivore populations from exploding, were suddenly empty. and the mammals and other survivors were moving into those roles, but they were moving into them with bodies that hadn't been shaped by those roles yet. They were improvising. There were creatures called condylarths, a loosely defined group of early hoofed mammals, many of them quite generalist in their habits. Some were pig-sized, some were dog-sized. They moved through the undergrowth eating plants and small animals and whatever else they could find. They were, in a sense, the rough drafts of what would eventually become deer, horses, rhinos, pigs. But the rough drafts don't look much like the final product. There were early herbivores called pantodonts, some growing to the size of modern hippos, which in the early Paleocene made them giants. These animals had stout, heavy bodies and moved slowly through the forest. They were not graceful, they were not elegant, but they were filling a role, large herbivore, that had been empty since the Triceratops and their relatives disappeared. There were early predators, creodonts, archaic carnivores, that were similarly rough around the edges, not quite the sleek, efficient predators of later eras, but functional, working, hunting. And there were birds. Extraordinary birds. In the absence of large predatory mammals, the early Paleocene saw something remarkable happen in several parts of the world. Large flightless birds became apex predators. I want to sit with this for a moment because I find it genuinely wonderful and slightly surreal. The most famous of these are the Forus racids, the so-called terror birds, though they're more of a Middle Paleocene and later phenomenon. But even in the early Paleocene, there are large flightless birds moving into predatory niches. The ecological logic is impeccable. Flight is expensive, metabolically speaking. If you're large enough that you don't need to flee predators, and if there are prey animals available that you can run down, then giving up flight and investing those resources in running and striking makes a certain sense. And so these birds grew tall and lost their flight feathers, and developed powerful hooked beaks and long, lethal legs. They became something that looked, at a certain distance, almost like a small theropod dinosaur, which makes a kind of sense, given where birds came from. Evolution, I've always thought, has a sense of humour. Or perhaps more accurately, evolution is conservative. It finds solutions that work and applies them in different contexts. The solution of large bipedal fast predator had worked for the theropod dinosaurs for 160 million years. When the ecological niche for large predator opened up again, evolution found its way back to a similar design. Not through the dinosaurs, they were gone, but through their closest living relatives. The birds were, in a very real sense, reclaiming something that had belonged to their ancestors. But back to the mammals. In the Paleocene, the mammals were doing something extraordinary, even if it didn't look extraordinary at the time. They were diversifying, rapidly. The fossil record shows an explosion of new mammal forms in the first few million years after the extinction. Lineages branching and rebranching, body plans being tested and modified and abandoned, a kind of evolutionary brainstorming that is almost visible in the fossil beds. This makes sense. The ecological landscape was, in a very real sense, empty, open, available. All those niches that had been filled by dinosaur species for 160 million years were suddenly vacant, and the mammals were moving into them with a speed that speaks to how powerful natural selection can be when opportunities are available. There were early primates, early rodents, early hoofed mammals, early bats, though flight in bats came a bit later, early carnivores, early whales, though again the transition to the sea came later, and it is one of the most extraordinary transitions in the fossil record. The Paleocene mammals were busy. They were not spectacularly successful yet. The world was still recovering, still patchy, still finding its new normal. But the work was being done. The groundwork was being laid. And underneath all of it, that quiet mystery was still there. That sense that the story wasn't quite adding up in certain places, that something had survived the extinction that our models didn't quite account for. I kept thinking about it as I read through the research for this story, and eventually I found something that made me sit up, straighter in my chair. Let me tell you what I found. There's a phenomenon in paleontology known as the Lazarus effect. It's named after the biblical story of resurrection, and it refers to species that disappear from the fossil record, seemingly going extinct, and then reappear later. Not because they actually went extinct and came back, of course. That's not how biology works. But because their populations dropped to such low numbers, or they retreated to such inaccessible regions that they left no fossils for a period, and then recovered and started leaving fossils again. The Lazarus effect is documented across multiple extinction events. But what's particularly interesting is its frequency around the end Cretaceous extinction. There are groups of organisms, marine invertebrates, certain plant lineages, even some vertebrates, that vanish from the fossil record right around the KPG boundary. That's the geological marker for the Cretaceous-Paleogene transition, and then reappear in the Paleocene, sometimes millions of years later. Most of these can be explained by refugia, places where local conditions were milder, where populations hung on through the worst of the impact winter, and then expanded again when conditions improved. But here's the thing about refugia. They should be visible in the fossil record. If a population survived in a refugium, those animals were living and dying there, and some of them should have left bones and teeth in the rock. We should be able to find the Paleocene populations that bridge the gap. For most Lazarus taxa, we can, imperfectly, partially, but the evidence is there. For some, it isn't. For some, the gap is very clean. The species disappears at the KPG boundary. Then, millions of years into the Paleocene, it or something very like it reappears, apparently out of nowhere, with no clear ancestral population to connect it to the past. I want to be very careful here, because I don't want to overstate the mystery. These gaps in the fossil record can have perfectly mundane explanations. Fossilization is a rare and patchy process. Animals can live in environments that don't preserve fossils well. Dense forest interiors, for example, or certain soil types that destroy organic material. The absence of fossils is not proof of absence of life, but some of the gaps are suggestive, and when you start to look at them in aggregate, when you map the patterns of disappearance and reappearance, and look at the geography, and try to understand why certain places seem to show higher than expected survival rates, a picture starts to emerge that is, at the very least, interesting. I'm not going to tell you what that picture is yet. I'm going to let the story arrive there in its own time. For now, let's keep following the thread forward. Approximately 56 million years ago, something happened. This is known as the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM, and it is one of the most dramatic and well-documented episodes of rapid climate change in the geological record. Over a period of somewhere between 20,000 and 200,000 years, very fast, geologically speaking, global average temperatures rose by somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. The Arctic was so warm that alligators and palm trees could survive there. The deep ocean warmed significantly. Sea levels rose. The entire climate system of the planet lurched into a new configuration. We're not entirely sure what caused it. The leading hypothesis involves a massive release of carbon, from volcanic activity, from the decomposition of organic matter, possibly from the thawing of carbon deposits on the seafloor. Whatever the cause, a huge amount of greenhouse gas entered the atmosphere in a short period of geological time, and the world warmed dramatically. And here's what I find fascinating about the PETM. It was in many ways a second test, a second filter through which life had to pass. And the things that survived it, and the ways they adapted to it, shaped the course of life in ways that are still visible today. Mammals thrived. This is worth emphasizing. While some lineages were stressed by the warming, the overall trajectory of mammal evolution during the PETM was one of rapid diversification and expansion. New lineages appeared. Body sizes in some groups decreased. Smaller bodies dissipate heat better, and there's actually a documented pattern called Bergmann's rule dwarfism, associated with the PETM, where many mammal species shrank over the warm period. But the diversity, the sheer number of different ways of being a mammal increased. It was during the Eocene that many of the major modern mammal orders began to take shape. Early horses appeared, small, many-toed, forest-dwelling. Early whales began their transition to the sea, starting as wolf-like land predators and gradually becoming more and more, aquatic over millions of years. Early elephants, early rodents, early bats, early primates. The world was becoming, in a slow and patchy way, familiar. The forests of the Eocene were magnificent. This is hard to fully appreciate when you're reading about it in books or listening to a voice in the dark, but I want to try to describe it because I think it matters to the story. The Eocene forests were warm, dense, and enormously diverse. The tropics extended much further poleward than today. Antarctica was not yet frozen. It was forested. The poles had ice in winter, but not the permanent ice caps we know now. The world was warmer and wetter than today, and the forest reflected that. In these forests, the primates were finding their footing. The earliest primates, small, tree-dwelling, large-eyed creatures, had appeared in the late Cretaceous or earliest Paleocene. They were, in essence, variations on the small nocturnal mammal theme, but adapted specifically for arboreal life. Grasping hands, forward-facing eyes for depth perception, flexible limbs for navigating complex three-dimensional environments. In the Eocene, these small primates diversified enormously. Different lineages evolved different solutions to the problem of being a primate, some staying small and nocturnal, others growing larger and becoming more diurnal, some moving toward more frugivorous diets, others toward more insectivorous ones. The family tree was branching and branching and branching, and one of those branches tens of millions of years in the future would give rise to the one kind of animal ever to look up at the night sky and wonder where it came from. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Here's something I want to introduce now, because it's relevant to the mystery that's been threading through this story. One of the more counterintuitive things about the recovery from the Chicxulub extinction is the speed with which certain ecological structures re-established themselves. When paleontologists look at the fossil record in the early Paleocene, just a few million years after the extinction, they find something surprising. Many ecological structures had already largely recovered. Not the species. The species were different. The dinosaurs were gone, and the mammals and birds and other survivors were filling those roles. But the basic architecture of the ecosystems, the relationships between producers, plants, consumers, herbivores, and predators, had reassembled itself with remarkable speed. This suggests something important about how ecosystems work. The specific species in an ecosystem are, in some ways, less fundamental than the roles those species fill. The role of large herbivore exists independently of whether it's filled by a triceratops or a pantodont. The role of apex predator exists independently of whether it's filled by a T-Rex or a giant flightless bird or, later, a saber-toothed cat. Ecology, in this sense, has a kind of shape that reasserts itself across time and across catastrophe. I find that deeply reassuring, for reasons I can't entirely articulate. But here's where the mystery deepens. If the ecological structure recovered quickly, and if the mammals were rapidly diversifying to fill the available roles, then we should see a fairly smooth transition in the fossil record. Old species out, new species in, clean succession, and for the most part, that's what we do see. But there are places in the fossil record where the succession is not quite clean. There are places where something shows up in the early Paleocene that looks, in terms of its ecological role, and in terms of some of its anatomical features, like something that should have come later, much later, as if it jumped the queue somehow, as if it arrived before its time. Paleontologists have noted these anomalies and debated them. Most of them have explanations that are technically adequate: convergent evolution, misidentified specimens, dating uncertainties. But some of them are stubborn. They don't go away when you apply the standard toolkit. And I've been thinking about what they might mean. Let me carry you forward in time, through the Eocene and into the Oligocene, and then I'll try to bring some of these threads together. The Eocene ended approximately 34 million years ago, and it ended with a significant change in global climate. The world cooled. Antarctica, which had been forested, began to glaciate. The global average temperature dropped by several degrees. The warm, lush Eocene forests contracted toward the tropics. Grasslands, which would eventually become one of the dominant ecosystems on Earth, began to expand. This cooling, which continued with fluctuations through the Oligocene and into the Miocene, had profound effects on life. Some groups that had thrived in the warm Eocene contracted dramatically. The early primates, for example, who had been globally distributed in the warm world, found their range shrinking as the forest shrank. Many lineages went extinct. The primates retreated to the tropics and subtropics, where the forests persisted. Other groups, particularly those adapted to more open, arid and variable environments, thrived. Grasses, as I mentioned, expanded dramatically. And with the grasses came new opportunities for the animals that could eat them, which required significant adaptations, since grass is a very different food from the leaves and fruits of forest trees. The cooling also accelerated the evolution of the large ungulates, the hoofed mammals, the horses, the rhinos, the deer and antelopes. These animals were adapting to the expanding grasslands, and you can see their evolution in the fossil record. Legs getting longer for running across open ground, teeth becoming more complex and ridged for processing tough grass, digestive systems becoming more elaborate for breaking down cellulose, The world was, in a sense, editing itself, testing forms, discarding what didn't work, keeping what did. And through all of this, the mammals continued their steady diversification. Slowly, generation by generation, extinction by extinction, the mammals were exploring the design space of what a warm-blooded, live-birth-giving, lactating vertebrate could be. The answer, it turned out, was almost anything. There are mammals today that weigh 30 million times as much as the smallest mammals. There are mammals that fly, swim, burrow, run, climb and glide. There are mammals that live in the deep desert and mammals that live under the polar ice. There are social mammals and solitary mammals, diurnal mammals and nocturnal mammals, herbivores and carnivores and everything in between. This diversity, this extraordinary range of what mammalness can be, was assembled, piece by piece, over the 66 million years following the asteroid impact. But I promised you a mystery, and I've been hinting at it for a while now. I think it's time to start drawing the threads together. A kind reminder to not forget to subscribe to keep the channel alive. Here is what I want to ask you to consider. When we reconstruct the history of life after the extinction, when we build the family trees, map the fossil sites, establish the timelines, we do so from the evidence that has been preserved, and the preserved evidence is necessarily incomplete. Most living things never become fossils. Most fossil beds are never found. Most of what happened in those early post-extinction millions of years left no physical trace that we can currently access, so we're working with a partial picture. Now, a partial picture can still be accurate. You can understand the broad outlines of a story from partial information. We do this all the time in science. We make inferences from incomplete data and test those inferences against additional evidence and gradually converge on something like the truth. But there are places where the partial picture shows clear anomalies, places where the evidence doesn't quite fit the model, and in those places the honest scientific response is not to ignore the anomalies, but to hold them gently and ask, what is this telling us? One of those anomalies, one I keep coming back to, involves the question of ecological complexity. Modern ecosystems are extraordinarily complex. The relationships between species in a mature ecosystem, predator and prey, plant and pollinator, parasite and host, competitor and competitor, are dense and intricate and have been assembled over millions of years of co-evolution. Species shape each other. They push each other into new adaptations. They create dependencies and partnerships that stabilize the whole system. Building a complex ecosystem takes time. It takes millions of years of these relationships being tested and refined and renegotiated. So here's the question. How quickly did ecological complexity re-establish itself after the extinction? The answer, according to the fossil record, is faster than our models predict it should have. Much faster, in some cases. And when I say our models, I mean the mathematical models of ecosystem assembly that ecologists use to predict how communities of species build up from scratch. These models are based on observations of real ecosystems recovering from real disturbances, wildfires, floods, volcanic eruptions, and they're reasonably good at predicting the pace of recovery. But they consistently underestimate the pace of recovery after the KPG extinction. The world rebuilt itself faster than it should have. Why? I've spent a lot of time with that question, and there's a conventional answer. The models are wrong, or the extinction wasn't as complete as we think, or there are aspects of early Paleocene ecology that we're not capturing in our models. Those explanations are probably partly right. Science is always partly right, but there's another possibility, a stranger one that I find myself returning to on slow evenings when the more conventional explanations start to feel thin. What if something helped? I want to tell you about a place called Hell Creek. Hell Creek is a geological formation in the Badlands of Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota and South Dakota, the American Great Plains essentially. It's one of the most intensively studied fossil sites in the world, and it spans the KPG boundary. You can stand at Hell Creek and see, in the layers of rock, the transition from the Cretaceous to the Paleocene. The boundary is visible. In some places you can almost put your hand on it. Below the boundary, Triceratops, T-Rex, hadrosaurs, the last of the great dinosaurs. Above the boundary, mammals, birds, the beginning of the New World. Paleontologists have been working Hell Creek for well over a century. The collection of fossils from this site is enormous. Thousands of specimens representing hundreds of species spanning millions of years of geological time. It's about as complete a picture as we have of the transition from one world to another. And what the Hell Creek record shows, when you look at it very carefully, is something that has generated considerable debate in the paleontological community. The early Paleocene fauna at Hell Creek, the animals living in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, are not what you'd expect if the extinction had been complete and the recovery started from near zero. There are animals in the early Paleocene of Hell Creek that show surprisingly sophisticated adaptations for their ecological roles, adaptations that, based on the typical pace of evolution, should have taken longer to develop. Now, one explanation is that these adaptations are inherited from pre-extinction ancestors, that the lineages which survived the extinction already had these traits and passed them on. That's plausible, it's probably mostly correct, but there are some traits that don't trace cleanly to pre-extinction ancestors, features that appear in the early Paleocene without obvious antecedents, features that seem, in a word, novel. Let me tell you about teeth. Teeth are extraordinarily important to paleontologists because they're the hardest part of an animal's body and the most likely to fossilize. A huge proportion of what we know about ancient mammals comes from teeth alone. Tiny fossil molars, premolars, incisors recovered from ancient lake beds and river deltas, each one telling a story about what the animal ate, how it processed food, what ecological role it played. Mammal teeth are particularly informative because they're so variable. Different mammal species have very different teeth, shaped by millions of years of selection for their specific diet. You can identify many fossil mammal species from a single molar. In the early Paleocene, there are tooth types that appear without clear precursors, molar shapes that hadn't been seen in pre-extinction mammal lineages showing up in the fossil record within 1 million or 2 million years of the impact. Adaptations for specific diets that, by the standard reckoning, should have taken longer to evolve. Now, 1 million or 2 million years is a long time in some contexts. Evolution can work very quickly when selection pressure is strong, and the post-extinction world provided extraordinary selection pressure, so this is not necessarily anomalous. But some of these dental novelties cluster in space as well as time. They appear in multiple geographically separate populations more or less simultaneously, as if the same innovation was being arrived at independently, in different places, at the same time. Convergent evolution is real and well documented. It happens when the same ecological problem presents the same solution independently to unrelated lineages. Flying evolved separately in birds, bats, and pterosaurs. Streamlined body shapes evolved separately in dolphins, sharks, and ichthyosaurs. Similar environments create similar designs, so convergent dental evolution in the early Paleocene is not impossible, but the rate of convergence is high, higher than expected. I want to try to articulate the feeling of looking at this data because I think the feeling is informative. It's not the feeling of discovering something that contradicts what we know. It's more subtle than that. It's the feeling of looking at a picture that is mostly clear and finding a small region of it that is blurry. Not wrong exactly, just not quite as resolved as the rest. That blurriness might be an artifact of how the picture was made, a limitation of the method, not evidence of something unusual, or it might be evidence that there's something in that part of the picture that we're not yet seeing clearly. Paleontologists are careful, rigorous people, and the good ones are honest about what the record does and doesn't show. The honest consensus is that we don't have a complete picture of the early post-extinction world, and some of the things that don't quite fit our models might fit better once we have more data. That's the sensible position. I hold it. But I also hold alongside it a sense of genuine wonder at the places where the story gets blurry. Because the blur is where the interesting things might be hiding. Let me tell you about the recovery of the tropical forests. After the extinction, the tropical forests, which had been among the richest and most complex ecosystems on Earth, were devastated. The canopy collapsed. The complex vertical structure of the tropical forest, with its stratified layers of life from the forest floor to the emergent treetops, was flattened. The recovery of tropical forests is well documented in the fossil pollen record. Plant pollen is extremely well preserved in sedimentary rock, and it changes rapidly enough to be a sensitive indicator of what kinds of plants were present at any given time. By analysing pollen samples through the KPG boundary and into the Paleocene, scientists can reconstruct the history of plant communities with considerable precision. What the pollen record shows is a period of dramatic simplification after the extinction, a fern spike, as it's called, where fern spores dominate the record for a brief interval as ferns, which are good at early colonization of disturbed ground, took advantage of the cleared landscape. Then, gradually, over thousands and tens of thousands of years, other plant groups began to return. What's interesting is what came back, and in what sequence. In general, the plants that returned first were generalists, species with wide tolerances capable of growing in disturbed variable conditions. Then came the specialists, the more complex community structure, the intricate relationships between plants and their pollinators and seed dispersers. This makes sense. What's slightly harder to explain is the speed of the recovery in certain tropical regions. Paleobotanists studying Paleocene tropical fossils in parts of South America and Africa have found evidence of ecological complexity, diverse, stratified plant communities with sophisticated pollinator-plant relationships, appearing substantially earlier than their models predict. Not impossibly early, not wildly anomalous, just early, slightly ahead of schedule. Now, I've been building towards something for several acts now, and I think it's time to tell you what I think the mystery is actually about. What the twist is, not a dramatic twist, not a revelation that overturns everything, but a quiet reorientation, a different way of looking at the same picture. Here it is. What if the recovery from the extinction event was, in certain ways and in certain places, influenced by the very thing that caused the extinction? Not the asteroid itself, of course, but the conditions the asteroid created. Let me explain. The Chicxulub impact didn't just kill things, it also changed things in ways that, over time, were enormously productive. The mass death of organisms released enormous quantities of organic matter into soils and sediments, a vast and sudden fertilization of the environment. The temperature changes opened up new ecological possibilities. The elimination of dominant species created empty niches. The altered chemical environment, particularly the changes in ocean chemistry, set the stage for evolutionary experiments that wouldn't have been possible in the stable, established ecosystems of the late Cretaceous. In other words, the asteroid didn't just end a world, it created a new one, rapidly, violently, but also thoroughly, and the organisms that survived into this new world were not the same as the organisms that had existed before. They were changed, not by the asteroid directly, as that's not how evolution works, but by the selection pressures the asteroid created. Only the toughest, most adaptable, most flexible survived. And when those survivors began to diversify, they were doing so from a starting point that had already been pre-filtered for adaptability. The mammals that began to diversify in the early Paleocene were the descendants of 66 million years of survival. They were, in a very real sense, the most adaptable mammals that had ever lived, because all the less adaptable ones had been eliminated. And perhaps that's why the recovery happened faster than our models predict. Not because something external helped it along, but because the survivors were extraordinary, because the starting point was already exceptional. The twist isn't that something miraculous happened. The twist is that the extinction itself was, in a quiet and terrible way, a gift. The worst day in the history of complex life on Earth was also, ultimately, the beginning of the story that led to us. I find myself sitting with that for a while. There's something uncomfortable about it. The idea that catastrophe can be generative, that destruction can be necessary. I don't think it's meant as a prescription for anything. Nature is not a moral guide, but as a description of how things actually work, as an honest account of the history of life on Earth, it seems right. The big extinctions and the big radiations are linked. They're not separate events. They're two halves of the same process, and we are here because of that process. Let's move forward in time. Through the Oligocene cooling, through the gradual assembly of something increasingly recognizable as the modern world, into the Miocene, an epoch that lasted from approximately 23 million years ago to about 5 million years ago. The Miocene is in many ways where the world we know was really built. The grasslands that had begun to expand in the Oligocene continued their extraordinary spread through the Miocene. By the middle of the epoch, vast savannas and temperate grasslands covered enormous areas of all the major continents, and with those grasslands came the animals that defined them. The horses of the Miocene were becoming more recognizable, single-toed, long-legged, built for speed and endurance on open ground. Their teeth were becoming complex, high-crowned grinders capable of processing abrasive silica-rich grasses. The proboscideans, the elephant lineage, were exploring an extraordinary array of forms. There were mastodons and gomphotheres and numerous other groups, some with upper tusks, some with lower tusks, some with both, some with bizarre shovel-like lower jaws. The proboscidean family tree of the Miocene was wonderfully, bewilderingly diverse. There were large grazing rhinoceroses on the grasslands of Asia and North America. There were massive giraffes, though the long-necked forms we know today were just beginning to develop. Early Miocene giraffes had much shorter necks. There were early forms of bovids, the group that would eventually give rise to cattle, bison, buffalo, sheep, goats, and antelopes, beginning to diversify on the expanding grasslands. The predators who hunted these grazing animals were similarly diversifying. The saber-toothed cats, which most people know from the famous saber-toothed tiger, though that term isn't quite accurate, were reaching their peak diversity in the Miocene. These were cats with elongated upper canine teeth, sometimes spectacularly long, used for dispatching large prey. They were, in their way, as extraordinary as any Cretaceous predator. The world was filling up. The ecological niches that had been empty in the early Paleocene were now thoroughly occupied. The recovery was, in a broad sense, complete, and in the forests and woodlands of Africa and Asia, the primates were doing something that would eventually change everything. In the Miocene, the primate lineage was diverse and widespread. Apes, the group that includes gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans, had appeared by the early Miocene and were diversifying rapidly. There were dozens of ape species in the Miocene, occupying forests across Africa, Europe, and Asia. It was, in fact, the golden age of apes. There were more species then than exist today. Most of those lineages went extinct as the climate cooled and the forest contracted in the later Miocene and Pliocene. But one lineage, small, probably bipedal, probably living in a mosaic of forest and more open woodland, survived. The genus Australopithecus appeared in Africa sometime around 4 million years ago, small-brained by our standards, but bipedal, walking upright on 2 legs, with the arms freed from locomotion. The reasons for bipedalism are still debated. Perhaps it was an adaptation for moving between forest patches in an increasingly fragmented landscape. Perhaps it allowed individuals to carry food or infants. Perhaps it enabled heat dissipation in an increasingly hot and open environment. Whatever the reason, bipedalism was the beginning of something, because once your arms are free, things become possible that weren't possible before. Tools, the manipulation of objects, the ability to carry things, the ability to throw things, which matters enormously, both for hunting and for defense, the ability to make things, and with tools came a feedback loop with the brain. Making and using complex tools requires spatial reasoning, planning, memory, communication. These are demanding cognitive tasks, and the fossil record shows, over the following 2 million years, a dramatic increase in brain size in the hominin lineage. Generation after generation the brain grew, and as it grew, it enabled new behaviours, and those new behaviours selected for further growth. By approximately 2 million years ago, the first members of the genus Homo had appeared. By 1 million years ago, fire was being used. By 300,000 years ago, something we would recognise as our own species, Homo sapiens, had emerged in Africa. And here we arrive at the deepest layer of the mystery. Because here's what I want you to think about. We traced the line from that warm-blooded, wide-eyed creature in the dark, the marginal mammal of the Cretaceous, through 66 million years of catastrophe and recovery and diversification, through the Paleocene and Eocene and Oligocene and Miocene, through the emergence of grasslands and the diversification of the hoofed mammals, and the final contraction of the primate lineage, all the way to the moment when one species of great ape started looking up at the stars and wondering where it came from. That species is us. And the reason we're here, the reason we exist at all, is the asteroid. Without the asteroid, the non-avian dinosaurs would presumably have continued to dominate the large animal niches. The mammals might have continued to evolve, but they would have done so in the margins, constrained by the ecological dominance of the dinosaurs. The enormous open landscapes that enabled the evolution of large, fast, intelligent mammals might never have existed. The particular sequence of events that led to the emergence of bipedal, large-brained primates might never have occurred. We are, in some meaningful sense, children of the catastrophe. There is a word in Japanese, mono no aware, which means something like the pathos of things, a gentle, bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things, the beauty that is inseparable from transience. I think about that word when I think about the dinosaurs. They were magnificent. They dominated the Earth for 160 million years, 3 times longer than our current distance from them in time. They came in thousands of species, from tiny feathered creatures barely larger than sparrows to the enormous titanosaurs whose single footsteps left impressions in rock that we find today. They were not the slow-witted, cold-blooded monsters of old movies. Many of them were warm-blooded, fast, intelligent, socially complex. They were, in many ways, extraordinary. And they're gone, all except the birds. And their going made us possible. There's something in that worth sitting with, something that deserves quiet. I told you earlier that the mystery had a twist, and I gave you one version of it. The idea that the extinction was, in a deep sense, generative, that the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life was also the beginning of the story that led to us. But there's another layer, a smaller one, a quieter one, and it has to do with something that I don't think gets enough attention in the popular telling of this story. Here it is. The dinosaurs didn't entirely disappear. Now, I don't mean this in the birds are dinosaurs sense, though, of course, that's true and important. I mean something slightly different. I mean that the influence of the dinosaurs, their legacy, their impact on the world, and persisted long after they were gone, in ways that we're still discovering. Consider the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Flowering plants diversified enormously during the Cretaceous, in part because of their relationship with dinosaurs. The large herbivorous dinosaurs, the sauropods and the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians, were constantly reshaping the landscape. They ate vegetation in enormous quantities, preventing any single plant species from monopolizing an area. They trampled and disturbed the ground, creating open patches where new plant species could establish themselves. They moved seeds around in their guts, depositing them with a supply of fertilizer in new locations far from the parent plant. In other words, the flowering plants co-evolved with the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs shaped the plants, and the plants shaped the dinosaurs. It was a relationship built over tens of millions of years. When the dinosaurs disappeared, the flowering plants had to find new partners. The mammals, as they diversified in the Paleocene and Eocene, stepped into many of the roles the dinosaurs had played, eating vegetation, disturbing the landscape, dispersing seeds, and the flowering plants, which had been shaped by life with dinosaurs, found themselves being further shaped by life with mammals. The fruits we eat today, the sweet, colourful, fragrant fruits that attract mammals and birds to eat them and disperse their seeds, are in a sense the product of that long, evolutionary conversation between plants and their animal partners, a conversation that started with dinosaurs and continued with mammals. When you eat an apple, or a mango, or a berry, you're eating something that was shaped, in part, by the dinosaurs. Consider also the global carbon cycle. The dinosaurs over 160 million years processed enormous quantities of organic material. They ate plants. Their bodies stored carbon. When they died, their remains contributed to the carbon-rich organic layers that we now mine as fossil fuels. Though, the common claim that oil comes from dinosaurs is actually largely incorrect. Most petroleum comes from much older marine organisms. But the dinosaurs did contribute to the global carbon cycle in significant ways. When the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, the carbon cycle was disrupted. The large-scale movement of carbon through large herbivore bodies, which had been a feature of the biosphere for over 160 million years, abruptly changed. This had long-term effects on atmospheric composition, on soil chemistry, on the distribution of organic carbon in the environment. The loss of the dinosaurs changed the chemistry of the world. Consider also the parasites. This one is less often discussed, but it's fascinating. Every complex, diverse ecosystem supports an enormous community of parasites, organisms that live on or in other organisms, ticks, mites, worms, fungi, bacteria, viruses. These parasites are not just along for the ride, they're an integral part of the ecosystem's function. They regulate population sizes, they drive evolution, they mediate the relationships between species. When the dinosaurs went extinct, their parasites went with them, or most of them did. But parasites, like hosts, sometimes make it through catastrophes, and there are suggestions in the parasitological record that some lineages of parasites that had been associated with dinosaurs survived by transferring to new hosts, the birds and mammals that inherited the world. Some of the parasites in our world today may trace their lineages to parasites that once fed on Cretaceous dinosaurs. And then there's this, the microbiome. The gut microbiomes of large vertebrates. The communities of bacteria, archaea, fungi, and other microorganisms that live in the digestive systems of animals are shaped by millions of years of coevolution between the animal and its microbial community. Large herbivorous dinosaurs would have had elaborate gut microbiomes. Communities of microorganisms evolved specifically to help process the plant material the dinosaurs ate. When the dinosaurs died, their microbiomes died with them, mostly. But microorganisms are extremely hardy. Some of them can survive in dormant form in soil or sediment for very long periods. Some can transfer between hosts. Some can establish themselves in new hosts that eat similar food. The gut microbiomes of modern large herbivores, the cattle and horses and elephants and deer that graze and browse across the modern world, were partly assembled from the microbial communities of the Cretaceous, not directly, not in a simple lineage, but through billions of generations of transmission and evolution and re-establishment in new hosts. We're still carrying, in a sense, traces of the Cretaceous world. In the microorganisms in the soil, in the parasites that infect our livestock, in the chemistry of the fruits we eat, in the structure of the ecosystems that sustain us. The dinosaurs are gone, but they didn't entirely leave. That's the real twist. Not a dramatic revelation, not a secret that overturns everything, just the quiet realization that nothing in biology truly ends. Everything flows forward. Everything influences what comes next. The dinosaurs shaped the world. The world was shaped by the dinosaurs. When the dinosaurs went away, the world they had shaped continued, changed, emptied, recovering, but still carrying the imprint of what had been. And the mammals that inherited that world were shaped by it. And we are those mammals at the end of 66 million years of accumulation and change. We carry the dinosaurs in the structure of our world, in the food we eat, in the air we breathe, in the ecology that sustains us, in the fossil records that we dig up and spend our lives trying to understand. There's a geological timescale that scientists use to organize Earth's history, and one of the things I love about it is that it doesn't have a final chapter. It doesn't end. The Cenozoic era, the era of mammals and birds, the era that began 66 million years ago at the KP boundary, continues to the present day. We're living in it right now. The Holocene epoch, which began about 11,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, is the epoch we currently inhabit. And the Holocene is, in geological terms, an eye blink. 11,000 years. That's the time since the last major glaciation, since the ice sheets retreated, and the world warmed again, and the first cities began to appear, and the first writing systems and the first complex civilizations. 11,000 years, sitting atop 66 million years of mammal evolution, which sits atop 160 million years of dinosaur dominance, which sits atop hundreds of millions of years of earlier animal life, which sits atop billions of years of microbial life. We are the most recent thing to have happened on a planet that has been happening things for an incomprehensibly long time. What does it mean to be the most recent thing? I've been thinking about that question more and more as I've worked on this story. Not in an anxious way, not as a source of existential dread, but in a genuinely curious way. What does it mean to be the chapter of the story that's being written right now? One thing it means is that we have obligations. Not moral obligations in a cosmic sense. The universe doesn't hand out obligations, but obligations in a simpler, more practical sense. We are the inheritors of 66 million years of evolution. We are the current stewards of the biosphere that took that long to build, and we have, in the space of a few centuries, become powerful enough to significantly alter that biosphere. The tools that evolution gave us, big brains, flexible hands, language, culture, technology, have made us extraordinarily capable enough to do things that no previous species has done, to significantly alter the chemistry of the atmosphere, to drive other species to extinction at rates approaching those of the great mass extinctions, to reshape landscapes on a continental scale. These capabilities are, in themselves, a product of the deep history we've been exploring tonight. We are what the 66 million years of post-extinction evolution produced. Our capabilities are a consequence of all that history. And so, in some sense, the question of how we use those capabilities is a question about what that long story has been building toward. I don't want to be preachy about this, and I don't want to end a sleep story on a note of anxiety. That's not what this is for. But I do think there's something worth carrying forward from the story we've been telling tonight. A piece of context, a sense of the deep time and the deep struggle that produced the world we've inherited. When you understand where something came from, really understand it, not just abstractly but viscerally in the marrow, it changes how you hold it. The world is not a backdrop. It is not a resource. It is 66 million years of recovery and rebuilding and astonishing, patient, creative work. It is the result of what survived the worst day in the history of complex life and found a way to grow again. Let me bring you back to that small mammal in the dark, the wide-eyed, whisker-faced creature, small enough to fit in your palm, hiding from the giants, living in the margins, eating whatever it could find. Waiting, in a sense, though it didn't know it was waiting. That creature's direct descendants are harder to point to than you might think. The early Paleocene mammal fauna is complicated, and the precise phylogenetic relationships are still being worked out. But in a very broad sense, in the sense that matters tonight, that creature is your ancestor. My ancestor. The ancestor of everyone who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt that peculiar mixture of wonder and smallness that seems to be the defining human emotional response to the cosmos. We came from the dark, from the margins, from the places the giants didn't bother with. And then the giants were gone, and we moved out into the sunlight and found that the whole world was ours to explore. 66 million years of exploring it, and we're still just getting started. This brings me in a roundabout way to the last piece of the mystery, the one I've been holding back. There's a question that rarely gets asked, and I think it's worth asking. The Chicxulub impactor came from space. It was a piece of rock, probably a fragment of an asteroid or a comet, dislodged from its stable orbit by the gravitational influence of Jupiter, or by a collision in the asteroid belt and gradually drawn toward the inner solar system over millions of years. Its arrival on Earth was, from the perspective of orbital mechanics, inevitable once it was set on that trajectory. The physics were decided long before it hit. But the impact itself, the specific location, the specific angle, the specific energy, those were, in a meaningful sense, contingent. If the asteroid had arrived at a slightly different time, it would have hit a different part of the Earth. If it had hit the deep ocean rather than the shallow continental shelf, the sulfur-rich rock of the Yucatan might not have been involved, and the sulfur aerosols that contributed heavily to the impact winter might have been less significant. Some models suggest that if the impact had occurred even 30 seconds earlier or later, the angle would have been different enough that the outcome for life on Earth might have been substantially different. The extinction that made us possible was not inevitable in its details. It was contingent. It depended on a specific chain of events. And that chain of events, that particular configuration of fate and physics and rock hurtling through the dark, produced us. I find that overwhelming in a quiet way, not in a way that makes me feel small, in a way that makes me feel the weight and the significance of being here, of having, against all the odds and all the contingency, arrived. We are a very specific result of a very specific history. We are not what the universe was planning. The universe doesn't plan. But we are what happened. Exactly and particularly this. These minds, these bodies, this capacity for wondering about things that happened 66 million years ago and connecting them to the present moment. That's what we are. And we exist because a rock fell. Let the story rest here for a moment. Let your mind be quiet. Let the enormity of the deep time settle over you, not as a weight, but as something like water, something you can float in. The 66 million years is not behind you. In a sense, it's still happening. You are a point in a process that began with that catastrophe and has not stopped. The same biological imperative that drove that small mammal in the dark drives you. The same evolutionary pressures that shaped the Paleocene mammals shaped your lineage, generation by generation, all the way to you. You're not separate from the deep history. You are the deep history in its current moment. The asteroid fell. The world ended. One world ended. And in the silence that followed, in the dark and the cold and the terrible patience of geological time, something new began. Something that was not planned, not directed, not guaranteed. Something that emerged from catastrophe the way life always emerges from catastrophe. Slowly, stubbornly, astonishingly. We traced that emergence tonight, from the first mammals in the early Paleocene, moving through the warming Eocene, surviving the cooling Oligocene, diversifying through the Miocene, right up to the moment some ancestral ape stood upright and began the long walk that eventually led here. To you, listening to this in the dark. The dinosaurs are 66 million years gone, and yet the world they shaped still holds their influence. The fruits on the trees, the chemistry of the soil, the deep structure of ecosystems that sustain all life on Earth, the birds singing outside your window, the last living descendants of the line that ruled the world. The story didn't end. It transformed. And transformation, it turns out, is what life does when it has no other choice. It finds a way through. It finds the tunnel in the dark. It comes out the other side into a world it didn't expect, and it makes that world its own. Tonight, as you let sleep come for you, I hope you carry something of that story with you. Not the catastrophe, let that go, but the recovery, the patience, the extraordinary creativity of life finding its way forward. You come from survivors, long unbroken line of them, all the way back to the first cells in the first warm oceans, and every single one of them, through all the extinctions and all the ice ages and all the upheavals, found a way through. So did you. Welcome back. If you were here for part 1, then you already know the shape of this story. You know about the asteroid. You know about the small, warm-blooded creature in the dark. You know about the long, slow, astonishing rebuilding of the world in the 66 million years after the Great Extinction. And you know about the mystery, the places where the fossil record doesn't quite match the model, the recoveries that happened a little too fast, the teeth that appeared without clear ancestors, the forests that reassembled themselves ahead of schedule. Tonight, we go deeper into those mysteries. And I want to warn you, gently, the way you'd warn a friend before a long walk, that some of what we're going to talk about tonight is less settled than what we covered before. We're moving from the well-mapped parts of the territory into the regions that are still being surveyed, the places where the scientists are still arguing, still digging, still holding up fragments of rock to the light and asking what they mean. I find those regions more interesting than the settled ones, personally. There's a particular quality of attention that uncertainty asks of you, a kind of open, receptive alertness, not anxiety, not the tightness of not knowing something you need to know, more like the feeling of sitting at the edge of a wide, dark lake at night, watching the surface for movement, perfectly content to not yet understand what's beneath. That's the feeling I want to bring to this. So settle in, breathe slowly, let your body be heavy and your mind be light. We have more story to tell. Let me tell you about something called the deep biosphere. For most of human history, we assumed that life existed at or near the surface of the Earth, in the oceans, on the land, in the air. Life needed sunlight, we thought, and everything flowed from that. Plants capture sunlight, animals eat plants, predators eat animals. The sunlight economy. This assumption was not unreasonable. It described most of the life we could actually see. But in the last few decades, something extraordinary has come to light, and I use that phrase with a quiet irony, because what I'm describing is life that exists in complete darkness. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, in the pores of rock, in underground aquifers, kilometers below the surface in conditions of crushing pressure and extreme temperature, there are microorganisms, bacteria, archaea, fungi. Communities of living things that have existed in the deep rock for potentially millions of years, surviving not on sunlight but on the chemical energy locked in the minerals around them. They metabolize so slowly that an individual organism might divide only once every 1,000 years. But they are alive. The total mass of life in the deep biosphere is genuinely difficult to estimate, but current figures suggest it might be comparable in total biomass to all the life on the surface of the Earth. The deep biosphere might be as large as the surface biosphere. Think about that for a moment. An entire parallel world of life, invisible to us until very recently, existing in the dark rock beneath our feet. Now. Why does this matter to our story? Because the deep biosphere may have played a role in the recovery after the Chicxulub extinction that we're only beginning to understand. The surface world was devastated. The impact, the fires, the darkness, the cold. These things killed the surface ecosystems. But the deep biosphere was, in a meaningful sense, insulated from all of that. The catastrophe that unfolded on the surface was irrelevant to a bacterium living 3 kilometers underground in the pores of granite, metabolizing sulfur compounds and reproducing once a millennium. The deep biosphere survived the extinction without noticing it, and in the aftermath of the extinction, as the surface world began to recover, the deep biosphere may have contributed to that recovery in ways that are still being investigated. Microorganisms from the deep rock carried to the surface by groundwater and volcanic activity may have helped reseed depleted soil communities. The chemical transformations that deep rock microbes perform, converting minerals into forms usable by surface life, may have accelerated the recovery of soil fertility. The deep biosphere is slow, it is ancient, it is not exciting in the way that velociraptors are exciting, but it is foundational. It is one of the most basic layers of the biosphere's resilience, and it may be one of the reasons the post-extinction recovery happened as quickly as it did. I find the deep biosphere genuinely profound in a way that's hard to articulate. There's something about the image of those organisms, metabolizing so slowly that their existence barely registers against human timescales, surviving for millions of years in absolute darkness, completely indifferent to everything happening on the surface, that puts things in perspective. The surface world, with its extinctions and its radiations and its catastrophes and its recoveries, is almost theatrical by comparison, dramatic, fast-moving. The deep biosphere is the bedrock beneath all that drama, patient in a way that makes geological time itself seem rushed. We focus on the surface story because we are surface creatures. We evolved in sunlight. We see with light. We think in the terms of the surface world. But the surface story is, in a sense, the skin of something much older and much deeper. The oceans are the other great mystery of the post-extinction recovery. When the Chicxulub asteroid hit, the effects on the marine world were catastrophic. The impact occurred in shallow water, so the immediate local effects were extreme. Superheated steam, tsunamis, enormous chemical disruption in the Gulf of Mexico and surrounding areas. But the global effects were also severe. The darkness that followed the impact shut down photosynthesis in the surface ocean. Phytoplankton, the microscopic plants that form the base of most marine food chains, collapsed. Without phytoplankton, the zooplankton that fed on them crashed. Without zooplankton, the fish and squid and other predators that fed on them crashed. And so on up the food chain. The ammonites, an enormously successful and diverse group of mollusks that had existed for over 300 million years, cousins of modern nautiluses, went extinct. All of them. A group that had survived every previous mass extinction, that had existed since before the dinosaurs, vanished completely in the KPG event. The mosasaurs, large marine reptiles, distant cousins of modern lizards and snakes, the apex predators of the Cretaceous seas, disappeared. The plesiosaurs, long-necked, flippered reptiles, favourites of popular imagination, vanished. Enormous numbers of fish species were lost. The oceans were not wiped clean, far from it, but the marine ecosystem was severely disrupted. The food webs that had been assembled over tens of millions of years were badly damaged, and yet the oceans recovered, and the pace of recovery, as in the terrestrial world, was in some respects faster than the models predict. Part of the reason for this is the ocean's deep water. Just as the deep rock insulated the deep biosphere from the extinction event, the deep ocean insulated its communities from the worst surface effects. Below the photic zone, the sunlit upper layer where photosynthesis occurs, the ocean is dark, cold, and runs on a completely different energy economy. Deep-sea communities are fed by marine snow, the constant gentle rain of organic particles falling from the surface, and by chemosynthetic processes around hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. The hydrothermal vent communities, in particular, are essentially independent of the surface. They are fed by chemical energy from the Earth's interior, not from sunlight. The extinction of surface, photosynthetic life would have had minimal direct effect on a hydrothermal vent community. These deep-sea communities would have been refugia, sheltered zones where life continued more or less normally, while the surface world went through its catastrophe. And as the surface recovered, these communities may have been a source of organisms and organic material that helped seed the recovering surface ecosystems. But there's another piece of the ocean recovery story that I find particularly interesting. When scientists look at the chemistry of ocean sediments laid down in the immediate aftermath of the KPG extinction, they find something unexpected. In the first few thousand years after the impact, the period when the surface ocean should have been at its most devastated, with phytoplankton nearly absent, there are signs of organic carbon cycling that don't match the expected picture of a dead sea. Something was keeping the carbon cycle going even in the darkest days. The leading hypothesis is that heterotrophic bacteria, microorganisms that consume organic carbon rather than producing it through photosynthesis, bloomed explosively in the aftermath of the extinction. With enormous quantities of dead organic matter available, the remnants of the collapsed phytoplankton and zooplankton populations, the bacteria that could eat that material had an unprecedented food source. These bacteria were invisible, tiny, and unspectacular. They weren't large predators or complex ecosystems, but they kept the carbon cycle functioning. They processed the organic material that would otherwise have accumulated and depleted the water of oxygen. They maintained the basic chemical infrastructure of the ocean while the photosynthetic ecosystem was rebuilding. The bacteria saved the oceans. Again, the small, hidden, patient things. There is a lesson in here somewhere. I keep finding it in different forms throughout this story. I am trying not to be too heavy-handed about it. Let's come back to the mammals. Specifically, let's come back to the brain. The mammalian brain is an extraordinary organ, and its evolution over the 66 million years since the extinction is one of the most remarkable stories in biology. But I want to tell you something about the mammalian brain that most people don't know, because it connects back to the mystery in an unexpected way. The mammalian brain is not, contrary to what you might assume, a new invention. It is a modification, an elaboration, a complexification of a much older structure. The deep architecture of the brain, the parts that handle basic physiological regulation, basic fear and reward responses, basic sensory processing, these are ancient. They were inherited from the reptilian ancestors of the mammals. They were present in the brain of that small Cretaceous mammal in the dark. They were present, in somewhat different form, in the brains of the dinosaurs. There is a structure in your brain called the amygdala, which handles threat detection and fear responses. It is very old. Its basic architecture predates the mammals. When you startle at a sudden noise in the dark, you're using neural hardware that has been present in vertebrate brains for hundreds of millions of years. Hardware that was present in the brains of Cretaceous animals. When you feel the pull of warmth, the need for connection, the particular comfort of being among familiar beings, these are mammalian things, deeply wired. But they were built on top of older structures, modified, elaborated, complexified, but not replaced. We are, in our deepest architecture, creatures of deep time. In the years following the extinction, the mammalian brain began its long elaboration. The neocortex, the large wrinkled outer layer of the mammalian brain that handles complex cognition, expanded dramatically over the Cenozoic era. In the early Paleocene mammals, the neocortex was relatively small. In the later Eocene primates, it was larger. In the Miocene apes, larger still. In us, it is so large relative to body size that our heads can barely accommodate it. What drove this expansion? The conventional answer involves several factors. The demands of complex social life, the requirements of tool use, the feedback loop between language and thought, the competitive pressures of living in groups with other large-brained individuals. All of these are real and well supported. But there's something else, something more fundamental. The neocortex expanded because the world that opened up after the extinction was, in a very real sense, a more cognitively demanding world than the world that came before. Think about it this way. In the Cretaceous, the mammals lived in a world structured by the dinosaurs. The ecological roles were defined. The dominant species were established. The margins were the only available territory. Surviving in the margins doesn't require enormous cognitive flexibility. It requires specific, well-honed adaptations to specific marginal niches. But in the post-extinction world, everything was open, unfilled. The mammals were moving into roles that had never been occupied by mammals before. Each new ecological opportunity was also a new cognitive challenge. How do you find food in a habitat type that no mammal has ever lived in before? How do you evade predators that are evolving at the same time you are? How do you navigate social relationships in increasingly complex societies? These challenges selected for flexibility, for learning, for the ability to generate new behaviors rather than relying entirely on inherited instinct. The open world of the Cenozoic was, in a sense, a school, and the brain was the organ that evolved to pass it. And this brings me to something that I find genuinely wonderful about the story of post-extinction life. The intelligence that eventually produced us, the curiosity, the creativity, the capacity for abstract thought, the ability to look at a piece of rock and infer what happened 66 million years ago. This is not a cosmic accident, tacked onto the end of an otherwise mechanical story. It is the direct product of the conditions created by the extinction, the empty world, the available niches, the demands of flexibility and learning. We are, in our intelligence, children of the catastrophe, not just in our bodies, in our minds. We're almost at the end of our journey for tonight. But before I bring you to rest, I want to spend a few minutes with something that I think is worth sitting with. The mystery I introduced in part 1, the slightly too fast recovery, the slightly anomalous dental novelties, the forest that reassembled ahead of schedule. I gave you one interpretation of that mystery. The survivors were pre-filtered for adaptability. The extinction itself was the mechanism of the acceleration. I believe that's largely true. I think it's a good and honest answer. But there's a dimension of the mystery that I deliberately held back, not to deceive, more to make sure we arrived at it at the right moment, with the right context. Here it is. The fossil record is, and always has been, a sample. A small, biased, geographically uneven sample of the total diversity of past life. We find fossils in places where preservation conditions were right, certain sedimentary environments, certain geological histories, certain chemistries. We find them where people have looked, which is heavily biased toward accessible, hospitable regions. We find them when we have the tools and the frameworks to recognize them for what they are. In other words, the fossil record reflects not just what lived, but what we've been able to see, and what we've been able to see has changed dramatically, even in recent decades. In 1994, a group of hikers in the Wollemi National Park in Australia stumbled across trees that were believed to be extinct for 66 million years. Living trees, a whole grove of them, growing in a hidden canyon, completely unknown to science until that moment. These are the Wollemi pines, and they are extraordinary. Their fossil record ends in the Cretaceous. They should not exist. And yet there they were, and are, living fossils, survivors of the extinction, tucked into a sheltered canyon in the Australian bush for 66 million years. Nobody knew. They were there all along. I find the Wollemi pine story both moving and slightly vertiginous. Moving because it suggests that survival can happen in ways that leave no trace in the fossil record. That a lineage can persist in a hidden corner of the world for an incomprehensible span of time without anyone knowing. Vertiginous because it opens a door. If a tree can do that, if an entire lineage of plants can survive the extinction and persist, hidden for 66 million years, what else might have survived? What other lineages, in other hidden corners of the world, made it through catastrophes that should have ended them? The coelacanth is another example, a fish that was believed to have gone extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, a fish we knew only from fossils, and then, in 1938, a fisherman brought one up off the coast of South Africa, alive. The Cretaceous fish, alive. Again, nobody knew. There is a term in conservation biology for species that exist at population levels so low that they're functionally invisible to survey methods: cryptic populations. These are populations that are real, living, breathing, reproducing, but so small and so scattered and so secretive that they don't show up in any standard survey. How many cryptic populations exist in the deep geological past? How many lineages made it through the KPG extinction at population levels too low to leave fossils, survived in obscure refugia for thousands or millions of years, and then either quietly went extinct without anyone ever knowing they had existed, or recovered and eventually merged back into the detectable biosphere? We don't know. We genuinely don't know, and that ignorance is not a failure. It's an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what we can see. But it does explain some of those anomalies, the teeth that appeared without clear precursors, the ecological adaptations that arrived ahead of schedule, the forests that reassembled more quickly than expected. Maybe some of those things had precursors, ancestral populations that survived the extinction at very low densities, in very sheltered places, and that left no fossils. but whose descendants eventually became visible in the record. The Lazarus taxa, in other words, might not be as anomalous as they appear. The gap in the fossil record might not be a gap in the life record. The lineage might have continued, invisible in some hidden canyon, some deep gorge, some sheltered island, surviving barely through the dark times, and then recovered and stepped back into the light. There's something I want to say about darkness and light and the things that persist through catastrophe. This story, the story of what really happened after the dinosaurs vanished, is, at its core, a story about persistence, about the refusal of life to simply stop, about the way that the very worst conditions, the most extreme catastrophes, the most complete-seeming devastations, still leave enough of something that the something can grow again. It's not a comfortable story in all its parts. The catastrophe was real. The suffering was real. Billions of individual organisms dying in darkness and cold. Whole lineages that had existed for millions of years simply ceasing to be. That's real, and it matters. But running alongside it, inseparable from it, is the other story. The story of what survived. The story of the small things in the dark, in the deep rock, in the hidden canyon, in the sheltered gorge, the things that waited and kept going. The rock still has more to say. There are fossil beds that haven't been excavated. There are regions of the world where geological surveys have barely been conducted. There are analytical techniques being developed right now. Ancient DNA extraction, protein analysis from deep time, isotopic analysis of fossil tissues that will allow us to read the fossil record in ways that weren't possible even a decade ago. The mystery is not solved. It may not be solvable in any final sense, but it is being deepened and enriched year by year, fossil by fossil, paper by paper, and in the meantime the Wollemi pines are growing in their hidden canyon in Australia. The coelacanths are drifting in the deep water off the African coast. The deep rock bacteria are metabolizing their slow chemistry in the dark, one division every 1,000 years. Life persists in the places we haven't looked. That is the final mystery. And it is also, I think, the final gift of this long story. The dinosaurs vanished 66 million years ago, and yet the world they shaped is still here, in the soil under your feet, in the birds outside your window, in the fruits on your table, in the structure of the ecosystems that clean your air and filter your water and hold the whole living surface of the earth in its intricate breathing balance. And in you too, in ways that are harder to trace but no less real. In the deep architecture of your brain that handles fear and warmth and the need for connection, an architecture that was old when the dinosaurs were alive. In the oxygen you're breathing right now, produced by the lineage of photosynthetic life that survived every extinction, every catastrophe, every dark winter, and kept making light from sunlight, kept exhaling the breath that feeds you. In the very fact that you are here, warm-blooded, curious, capable of listening to a voice in the dark and travelling 66 million years in your imagination. You're the long story's current chapter, not its conclusion. There is no conclusion, not yet, not for a long time if the story of the deep biosphere and the Wollemi pine and the coelacanth tells us anything. But its current chapter, the part being written right now. And like all good chapters, it builds on what came before, carries the past inside it, knows, even if only dimly, where it came from. The rock still has more to say, and so do you. Sleep well, traveller. The world is very old and very patient and very full of things we haven't found yet. Rest now. The story will still be there when you wake. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Okay, that opening line is chilling because it challenges how we usually think about these people. I want to believe they're just born evil because that's easier to digest, right? But the script points out that Kemper was this massive 6'9" guy who was basically just a broken kid on the inside. It's wild to think that someone that physically imposing was actually walking around with a vulnerable boy mindset. This is where it gets really dark. Imagine being a kid and your own mother looks at you and only sees the man she hates. That weaponized love mentioned earlier. That's some high-level psychological warfare. Clarnell wasn't just a mean mum. She was literally dismantling his identity before he even had a chance to build one. It makes you wonder how anyone survives a childhood like that without some kind of internal scarring. That phrase rewired his developing brain is the key here. It's not just about hurt feelings, it's biology. When the person who is supposed to be your safe harbor is actually the storm, your brain goes into survival mode. You can almost feel the tension building in the script. It's like watching a pressure cooker that you know is eventually going to explode. This part is so ironic, it's scary. She literally put him in a dungeon because she feared he was a monster, but by doing that, she gave him the exact environment he needed to become one. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You lock a kid in a dark basement alone with his thoughts, and you're basically asking for those thoughts to turn toxic. Man, the blueprints part gives me chills. This wasn't just weird kid behavior, he was literally practicing. When he's taking apart those dolls, he's not just playing, he's rehearsing for the real thing. It shows that by the time he actually started his crimes, he had already committed them 1,000 times in his head in that basement. Incubated it. That is the perfect word for it. It's like she put his trauma in a petri dish and let it grow. By the time he comes out of that basement, he's learned that the world is a place where you either have power or you're a victim. And after everything his mother put him through, you just know he wasn't going to choose to be the victim anymore. This is the moment where the story shifts from sad childhood to horror movie. 15 years old, and that quote, "I just wanted to see what it felt like." That lack of emotion is what makes Kemper so terrifying. There's no heat of passion there. It's just pure, cold curiosity. It's like he was testing a theory. This part honestly frustrates me, because it shows how dangerous a high IQ can be in the wrong hands. He wasn't getting better, he was just learning how to lie better. He turned his doctors into his teachers without them even realizing it. It's like he was a predator, learning how to wear a human mask perfectly. You have to be kidding me, this is the ultimate facepalm moment in history. The system ignored the experts and sent a known killer back to the woman who caused his trauma. It's like putting a recovering alcoholic in a room full of whiskey. You just know this is the exact moment the monster was officially set loose. The match in a room full of gasoline is such a perfect metaphor. You have this 6'9" guy who was already killed, living with a woman who treats him like he's nothing. The power dynamic had totally shifted, but she was too stuck in her ways to see that she was poking a bear that could literally snap her in half. This is the co-ed killer era. It's heartbreaking because these girls had nothing to do with his trauma, but to him, they weren't even people. They were just proxies. He was essentially killing his mother over and over again through these innocent strangers. It shows just how deep his obsession with her really went. This is the scariest part for me, the double life. He was literally hanging out with the cops who were looking for him. It shows how much he enjoyed the game. He wasn't just a killer, he was a performer. He used that high IQ to hide in plain sight, making the basement fantasies he had as a kid a terrifying reality. You could see this coming from a mile away, but it doesn't make it any less heavy. It's like the boss battle of his own twisted life. He realized that no matter how many other people he killed, the source of his pain was still sitting at the kitchen table. The cycle finally closed. That's a powerful way to put it. The dartboard detail, that is some of the most disturbing stuff I've ever heard. It's so literal. He wanted her to stop talking, so he silenced her in the most permanent and disrespectful way possible. It's the ultimate expression of how much he hated her. He didn't just want her dead, he wanted to humiliate her even in death. He simply clocked out. That is a wild way to end it. Most serial killers are caught or die in a standoff, but Kemper just finished his job. It proves that the whole thing was about her. Once she was gone, the monster didn't have a reason to exist anymore. It's a tragic, horrifying ending to a story that feels like it was written in stone the moment he was sent to that basement. Can you imagine being that dispatcher? You're expecting a crank call, and instead, you get a guy who sounds like he's reading a grocery list, but he's actually describing the most horrific crimes of the decade. The fact that he was articulate makes it so much worse. It's like he was proud of the work he did, or at least he finally felt like he had graduated from his own dark school. Calling his mother the source code is such a cold, analytical way to describe a parent. It's like he viewed his entire life as a computer program that went wrong. It really hits home that he wasn't killing for fun in the way some predators do, he was killing to solve a problem in his head. And the practice part? That's just heartbreaking for the families of those co-eds. Is that contrast again. The gentle giant who is actually a monster. He wasn't resisting arrest or trying to flee to Mexico. He was just finished. It's like he clocked out of a 9-to-5 job. He knew he was a psychological anomaly, and he almost seemed eager to let the experts poke around in his brain now that his mission was over. This is where the Mindhunter fans will recognise the story. It's wild to think that the reason we have modern criminal profiling is partly because a serial killer was smart enough to explain himself. He basically became an unpaid consultant for the FBI. He was teaching the good guys how to catch people just like him, which is a level of irony I can barely wrap my head around. That aura description is terrifying because it suggests that for these guys, the murder starts long before they even find a victim. He gave the FBI the why behind the what. He wasn't just telling them what he did, he was giving them the psychological map of a predator's mind. It's almost like he was still playing the professor role he started at the state hospital. This part always gets me. One minute he's helping them save lives, and the next he's reminding them that he could kill them with his bare hands. It shows that the monster never really went away. It was just sitting behind a desk. He enjoyed the power he had over those agents, the power of knowledge, and the physical power of his massive frame. Talk about a weird plot twist. The guy who silenced so many people is now the voice in someone's ear reading a book. It's such a bizarre way for his life to play out. It doesn't excuse anything he did, but it adds this extra layer of what if to his whole story. If he had been raised in a normal home, would he have just been a successful voice actor or a professor? This is actually the most human thing he's ever done, admitting he shouldn't be out. Most of these guys are constantly fighting for freedom, but Kemper knows exactly what he is. He's basically self-policing because he knows the monster is still in there. It's a somber realization that some things, once broken, just can't be fixed. She created a monster so powerful that it eventually consumed her. That is the ultimate summary of this whole tragedy. It's a perfect circle of trauma. The script ends on such a heavy note because it reminds us that while Kemper did the killing, the dark genesis started long before he ever picked up a weapon. It's a story with no winners, just a lot of lives destroyed by one woman's bitterness and one son's genius-level rage.